Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.
Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis Affamie History Podcast with your host, Wendy Aris. Today, we've got a fantastic episode lined up. Wendy will be sitting down with Mr. Josias Tembo, who is a PhD researcher at the Center for Contemporary European Philosophy at Radboud University in the Netherlands and a research associate in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pretoria. In this episode, they'll be discussing the article, Unveiling the Entanglements of Western Christianity and Racialization in Africa. So settle in, and let's get into the conversation.
Just wanted to thank you, Josias, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, to talk about your article, The Unveiling of Entanglements of Western Christianity and Racialization in Africa. And before we start, I'll have you just do a brief introduction of yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy, for inviting me to share my research on your platform. Yeah, as you said, my name is Josias Tembo. I'm a philosopher, a critical philosopher of race. I was born and raised in Zambia. I studied in South Africa, and now I work in the Netherlands. And yeah, being Black, raised in a post-colonial country, I got an education that really was not very critical of the colonial history that informed much of my life. And when I went to South Africa, actually, that's when I had the opportunity to meet teachers who were very concerned about how white and colonial the education system is in South Africa. And then from there, that's where I got an interest in doing a critical philosophy of race and African philosophy. And that's how I found myself in the Netherlands.
Perfect. No, thank you so much for that. I appreciate it. And I guess that goes right into my first question. What inspired you to explore the intersection of, Western Christianity and, of course, racialization in the African context?
When I studied critical philosophy of race in South Africa, most of it really focused on race as a biological category. And there was very little, almost nothing on how race was connected to Western Christianity. So one of my professors, Ramose Mohobe, he's still living, he's a South African philosopher. In his, I think, very, very important book called African Philosophy Through Ubuntu, he's the one who, in one of the chapters, really talks about how involved the Catholic Church was in the discovery of West Africa and the colonization of the Americas. So from there, and also having been raised as a Catholic, I found that to be very confronting. And then from there, I thought it would be interesting to dig into my own history and see how Christianity, which I strongly identified with, actually had a role in creating, the conditions that really denied African people and people of African descent and other, colonized people across the world their right to be human beings.
Yeah, no, definitely. I know that we talked about it just before we started recording about, it was mentioned in the slave codes in terms of the fact that it was only Europeans that pretty much had a soul at that particular time. So how does your article then challenge the traditional understanding of Christianity's role in Africa?
When I started sharing my idea with some other people who were not part of this small group I'm researching race and religion with, people strongly resisted the idea that, first of all, religion, Christianity can be foundational to racialization or racism because Christianity is just a faith. and Christianity believes in, in the salvation of all people and all that. But also from my own family members who are very, Christian, who, are Catholics, who say, no, how can you say that? This is not our experience in the church. So really there was a lot of pushback, and yeah, but against these positions or against this pushback, the more I read into the history of the early encounters between, Western Christians and sub-Saharan people, the more I discovered how religion was really central to framing sub-Saharan people as, either lacking the soul or having a soul, but really it needed, the Christian touch, the Christian conversion for them to stand a chance of, partaking, into the history of Christianity, or the history of humanity, as some of them used to call it.
No, definitely. It's very interesting. And then I guess this goes into, I guess, with the, how did the missionary activities, contribute to systems of racial classification or hierarchy?
The Christians played a very, very central role with regards to the transformation of African people into Christian subjects. And actually, before the Christians, the Portuguese actually were the ones that led the expansion of Western Christianity into the Atlantic. And already in the 1440s, they actually discovered that the world was bigger than, the Mediterranean. And actually, the work of Sylvia Winter, has a lot of important things to say on that. But then the Portuguese had sent missionaries into the Congo already in the late 1400s. And these played a very important role in terms of trying to keep the interest of the Portuguese crown within the Congo kingdom, and slowly started the process of Christianizing the Congolese, or the Congolese elite, some of whom actually converted. And when the local people protested against that, he had to go back to Portugal to try to get some help so that, he can impose his rule against, his own people. And then with the second phase of missionaries, while secular colonial settlers really focused mainly on the economic and the governmental project of racial colonialism, it was the missionary who really changed what the African philosopher Valentine Mudimbe calls the native's mind, because their work really was to reform, to shape how Africans understood themselves, understood their history, and also how they imagined their future. And the missionaries, through, of course, catechism, and also through Christian schools, did a lot of work to try to cut African people from their indigenous, forms of life. And for instance, a few years ago, I went to see my uncle in my village in Zambia. And then I asked him, how was it before colonialism in terms of how people named their children? He looked at me and smiled, and he said his grandfather told him that before the missionaries came, my people, if I can call them that, did not have surnames. I am Tembo because my father is Tembo. And this we inherited from Western Christianity. It was the missionaries who said, no, who is your father? Your father is the surname of your father, Tembo, then therefore you'll be Tembo. But actually what he told me is that they used to have a system of surnames where, for instance, Tembo as a surname had a father, but then Tembo as a son of that surname had other sibling surnames, for instance, like 6 or 7 of them. And when children are born in the family, they would be given any of the 4 or 5 surnames. So you may come from the same father and mother, but you may have 4 or 6 different surnames. And the idea of community, the idea of responsibility was very much imbued in giving what now we call surnames. For them, Tembo was responsible for taking care of these so many surnames which are his children, but also Tembo was a son or a child of, for instance, Dhaka. So there was this complex way of understanding name giving that was attached to social responsibility. That with missionaries who said no, now we name you Joseph Tembo or Josiah Tembo instead of Kondwani Tembo, for instance. So a lot of that history, a lot of that word making through Christianization was robbed from these people. And some of us who were born into Christianity, we lost that. We were not aware that actually we did not have surname, and surname was not just a biological genealogical inheritance, but it was more importantly a social responsibility. You see a lot of world reforming takes place through the missionaries. And you see a lot of people losing touch, either by force, mostly, but also, of course, within colonial encounter, others saw an opportunity. So you had people who would betray their own people and their own customs and their own ways of living, really to integrate into this imposed world. And yeah, a lot got lost, and also a lot got reshaped to meet the demands that Christian colonization had imposed on the people.
No, thank you so much for that. We'll just go to the next here, which is, how did the colonial era church records or educational systems reflect these racialized dynamics? So was there any additional changes due to church and educational involvement?
Where I come from in Zambia, also in some sections of South Africa or Zimbabwe or Botswana, you find that education as we know it was primarily brought by missionaries. And when they sort of imposed themselves in these communities, they demanded that really whatever pagan or uncivilized rituals and practices that you did, you had to leave them at the gate or at the door of the school. And then you had to be introduced to obviously Christian rituals. And I mean, the Catholic Church is very rich in rituals, which is very beautiful, very powerful. Of course, with a lot of negative implications for colonized people. So really, a lot of ritual practice that people had before the colonial encounter had to be abandoned and replaced by the Christian system. For instance, in the Chawa people of Zambia, when you become an adult, there's an initiation ceremony where boys will be taken to a certain excluded place where they'll stay there for some months or so, where they will be taught what it means to be a man and what it means to be an adult, for better or for worse. And then girls also will be taught the same. And when you go to school, they will say, no, stop that. That is paganism. Instead of that, we are going to give you Holy Communion. We're going to give you confirmation. We're going to give you all these things because it's these things that initiate you into, Christian adulthood. And within the Catholic Church, you see a lot of records. Actually, a few years ago when my grandmother died, there was a huge debate on how old she was. Initially, we thought she was 92. That's what was on her ID. And then when we looked at the church baptismal record, it said she died at 94.
Oh, wow.
So, so you have, but this baptismal card may tell us about her age, but also may tell us about how she was, brought into a different world and initiated through certain rituals. My grandmother died a very staunch Catholic. Yeah, and from my grandmother, I never heard anything about, and my grandmother was from Zimbabwe, the Shona people of Zimbabwe. Like I had nothing from my grandmother from that perspective in relation to Christianity. So Christianity really, through all these different rituals, sort of, cut her off. And consequently, also that cut me off from, my ancestral heritage.
So I guess, how did, Western Christianity contribute I guess, to the marginalization of African spiritual practices?
In, I think in, no, I think I may get, I may have wrong dates, but a few years ago, not a, yeah, in the 90s, there was his past now, the president of Zambia by then, his name was Frederick Chiluba, declared that Zambia was a Christian nation. Yeah. So you see, I mean, in that declaration, you see what kind of religion was accorded, national status, was accorded recognition by the state and its president, of course, at the exclusion of indigenous spiritual practices. And really, and these are the people who went through the missionary education system, who were taught that, to be civilized is to speak English, is, to believe in God, to believe in this and that. And a lot of these spiritual practices that I would argue we are not only spiritual in the sense of faith and how I feel about it, but really they inform the different aspects of their lives, including the political life. So these were pushed away. And in the article, for instance, I discuss Placid Temple, a Belgian priest who writes about Bantu philosophy. And for him, precisely, Bantu philosophy is important to the extent that it agrees with Western Christianity and it gives Christians the means to access, the souls of these Africans so that, you can cut them off from their pagan practices, and, give them the light of Western Christianity. So really you find a lot of this marginalization and erasure. And when I was writing this piece, I had a colleague from South Africa who wrote a paper, but then unfortunately we didn't include it in the special issue because it came a little bit late. And this special issue was, I mean, his article was discussing the concept of God in the Sotho people of Southern Africa. Modimo. The word for Basotho people of God is Modimo. And he argues that when the missionaries came, the people understood Modimo without gender. He was not God the Father, for instance. And Modimo did not live high up there in heaven. Modimo lived, underground. And Modimo was not the creator of anything, but Modimo was related to the experience of time. But then when the missionaries came, and these were English, I think, Protestant missionaries among the Basotho people, they're like, okay, these people are continuously saying Modimo, Modimo, Modimo. Okay, then what they actually mean when they say Modimo, they mean God the Father. And then there you see the erasure, the displacement, and really the understanding of spirituality, the understanding of transcendence was taken up and erased and put into, the English language. And they wrote the Sesotho language, and then they wrote the Sesotho Bible, and then Modimo now, after that, became God who is in heaven, and apparently who is male.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's kind of like, not necessarily discrediting, but almost discarding a part of who you are in order to now be encompassed into this, different type of line of thinking for this Christianity. So, and I guess, was there any space for, theological resistance or reinterpretation among African Christians?
Yes. And I mean, perhaps this is the contradictory part of Christianity. You find, for instance, I referred to Ramose Mugabe, who was my teacher. I referred the book of Valentine Mudimbe. Actually, Valentine Mudimbe is in the US, who wrote The Invention of Africa. Valentine Mudimbe was a monk in the Catholic Church. And then from there, I don't know what happened. He decided to leave. And then from there, really, he produced, The Invention of Africa. He also began, questioning what extent can we reconstruct or produce indigenous knowledge outside the Eurocentric model and the Christian framework. So you find a lot of people who tried to, a lot more like what happened to, enslaved Africans who were taken to the Caribbean, who were like, okay, let's mobilize everything that we have. The things that we remember from, across the Atlantic, but also what Christianity has given us, and develop our own theology based on what we believe to be most human in ourselves. perhaps even in these monsters who are enslaving us. So there was a lot of that as well on the African continent, and you have some churches that emerge in response to very specific refusal to integrate into European grown churches. And also in Zambia, for instance, you have this very contradictory figure, Emmanuel Milingo. He was the Archbishop of Lusaka, who became charismatic in the 80s, who in the 80s was writing books to say the problem with the Catholic Church is that it is forcing people to be Christians during the day and indigenous practitioners in the night. And people are really going back to their traditions and trying to find things that are very meaningful from there, and developing very unique theologies and very unique practices that respond to their existential need to live meaningful human lives. So there's been a lot, and to a certain extent you also begin to see, at least within the Catholic Church, a response to this sort of failure of converting these natives. You see them introducing inculturation, where they say, yeah, in that case, instead of just saying, the mass strictly the way we do it in Europe or in white America, in this case, we can try to include some, indigenous cultural practices, so that we make it, at home within these cultures. And a lot of anti-colonialists, such as a dear friend of Aimé Césaire, Senghor, was Christian himself. And really, you see some of the indigenous spirituality coming through the discourse of negritude, for instance. So you see a lot of resistance and a lot of ways really to try to salvage whatever they can from indigenous spiritualities. And in South Africa, for instance, there's a big movement on Ubuntu philosophy that really some scholars, they've gone to their roots and try to understand these ways of living, these cosmologies, these traditions that have been violently suppressed for centuries, and they're trying to to bring them back and to to incorporate even in some churches. Really, it's like, okay, what do we do with Bantu philosophy? What do we do with Ubuntu?
Exactly.
So you have a lot of resistance, although unfortunately also it's being co-opted by capitalism, where
Yeah, and we'll get just shortly. I just wanted to get one more question in regards to, why do you think it is important that we examine Christianity not just as a religion, but as a vehicle of colonial ideology?
For me, I think we cannot fully understand the history of race and racism without understanding the history of religion and Western Christianity. I'm saying Western Christianity because, for instance, Ethiopian Christianity is older than Western Christianity. Something that sometimes is often not acknowledged, because Western Christianity really, as it came to understand it, as it emerged and in the Middle Ages, so to say, it began in the 900s with the Gregorian Revolution, although it traces itself to the time of Jesus. But when Christianity extends itself beyond the Mediterranean, it understood itself as a religion. And Africans were not religious. They were Negroes and pagans. And even Muslims did not have religion. They were Saracens. Even Jews did not have, a religion. They were Jews. So religion meant Western Christianity. But through the missionaries, they now started seeing, when we go to these different places, seeing and looking at these different people, their different cultures, there's some similar things that they have with us. Let's call this thing religion. So, okay, so if we want to colonize them, if we want to murder them, if we want to enslave them, religion was actually the first vehicle of justifying, racial enslavement. And with the Protestants in Europe, fighting against the papacy, then they're like, I think let's define religion as faith. And let's, try to separate politics, because the Pope wants to have, has had, the power over politics.
Mhm.
So you see religion slowly, with colonization, with racism, sort of splitting itself from politics, but still remaining very political, because the very justification of enslavement through religion is a political, act. And the very management of communities and, putting education systems that taught them that they were subhuman is a political project. Yeah. So really, up until in the late 1600s, that's when the idea of race now starts to make a very strong presence.
Mm.
And by then, I mean, the Americas was under siege. The African continent was under siege. Asia was under siege by, so-called voyagers of discovery.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's from there really that religion slowly starts to be pushed at the back, so that they can even, justify dispossession and all that. And so we cannot understand the history of racism and colonialism without understanding religion. And religion, even the very word of religion, is what Western colonialism has given us.
No, it definitely it's very central. It's very central to all of what you've just mentioned, and we do need to not, I guess, approach it in terms of coming from an emotional standpoint, but to be able to disconnect a little bit and to be able to see it truly for what it was used for, unfortunately. And so now we're going to get into, I guess, the Bantu cosmology, because now how did Western Christianity challenge or attempt to replace, of course, the indigenous African spiritual frameworks such as the Bantu cosmology?
I think it's the name of this scholar of religion, David Chidester. I think it says religion, when when the missionaries first came to Africa, they said Africans did not have a religion.
Mhm.
And then later on they said, no, they have a religion, but a wrong one. And then, yeah, that to a certain extent still sticks today, where indigenous religions are not world religions, for instance,
Mhm.
where indigenous religions are seen, as a witness to the universality of Christianity. They are understood and defined in terms of their lack or opposition to Christianity. If not Christianity, then they'll say, the Abrahamic religions, that is Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. So really, that has been the struggle that a lot of indigenous spiritual practices have faced. And specifically with Bantu philosophy or Bantu cosmology, or as Fanon would like to say, let's not be pretentious to call them metaphysics. Let's just call them customs and, you know, forms of life. Or Caesar would call them, these, what did he call them again? The, the wisdom that informed these people's lives. Before Esset Tempos did his ethnographic research, and then he was so bold to say, actually, these Bantu people have a philosophy. And that was a scandal to a lot of white people. To some, Black Africans, it was a relief. But to the wiser Africans, they were like, wait, no, that's a problem as well. So really, in temples, you see, and later on also Alexis Kagame, you see the attempt to accept Bantu philosophy or Ubuntu cosmology to the extent that it is translated within the Christian language and within the Christian idea of what the universe should be, and what it means to be human, and how human beings should live. So you see a lot of that, and initially there was a lot written to celebrate this, but then later on, actually, people are like, no, there's something wrong here. When we go to our villages, or when we remember before we went to the colonial school, this is not how we were raised. This is not how we saw our parents. This is not how we saw the world. And this marginalization has to come to an end, because what, for instance, Temples calls Bantu philosophy is something very different from what later, for instance, Ramose Mugabe would write as Bantu philosophy, precisely because the center was not God. Yeah, the center was human beings and our relationships with everything else. And this ontological demand, ontological not in an essentialist way, but the very thing that we exist, there's a demand that we recognize and nourish all these relationships that we have with ourselves, with others, with the environment. I mean, these people understood that very well. That is why, for instance, if I'm called Tembo, which is maybe not, let me not use myself too much. In a lot of African languages, surnames such as Tembo, such as Njovu, Ondlovu, such as Dube, such as Piri, they're names of animals.
Mm-hmm.
And they were not random names.
Mm-hmm.
They were names that, connected you to the spirit of this animal and your responsibility to care for these animals in the way that they also care for you, because the understanding in some of these contexts is that you don't have a paternalistic relationship towards nature or these animals. You take care of each other. So really, some of these understandings, they're coming up, and you're like, okay, but of course they're coming up to much of the population that is very much in love with the white Jesus. so 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 you have to, come back again and say, actually, Christians cheated us, because actually what our forefathers had would not have given us this climate change that we have, this climate catastrophe, because they understood that we are interdependent.
Yeah.
And for us to survive, we need care, not exploitation, not instrumentalization. Yeah, so really, Bantu spirituality, Bantu cosmology is coming up, is being, so to say, excavated,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and bringing these powerful ways of thinking and living that religion actually denied us and erased.
No,
Yeah,
definitely, because a lot of these, whether it's Bantu or Ubuntu, these are very things that are very central to us, but we may not know it as
yeah,
these particular things. And what you've mentioned in terms of being there to help the community or looking out for one another, those are very centralized themes. So, and I know you mentioned this earlier before, but how has the rise of African independent churches or contextual theology responded to these legacies?
at the moment I don't have a lot of data
Mhm.
on what is happening now, but for instance, in South Africa, you have what do they call themselves? Zionists. It's a very interesting name now with what is happening in Palestine. But uh, you with this community, really, they said we have enough. We're going to have our own. We are going to have our own theology.
Mhm.
It's they imagine themselves as the army of God. The army of God, of course, responding to the colonial violence and also the violence of the Christian churches. And indeed, they picked that up and formed a very big Black African church in South Africa.
Mhm.
Of course, somebody can point out a lot of problems, but that's s- just some aspects of this church movement, if we can call it that. And you see a lot of emphasis on community, where you see that actually there is a lot that they're taking from their indigenous African spiritualities and sort of blending it with some aspects of Christianity that they can relate to.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have a number of those, but then unfortunately nowadays we have these prosperity churches. These are the ones that really have sort of taken over the Christian landscape, and more than anything, in my view, I may be wrong, they really take up this neoliberal capitalist approach to Christianity that already has a long history of exploitation. Yeah, and there's very little
Mhm.
of inspiring and life affirming indigenous practices in such Christian movements.
And we'll just stick on this theme, but how has, I guess, the Bantu philosophical principles, helped to decolonize theological thought in Africa today?
Um, there there are a lot of I'll give an example of South Africa. There's a lot of discussions on South African truth and reconciliation after apartheid. And of course, it has a lot of problems. But but the very fact that Mandela and Desmond Tutu did not feel vengeful to say, you have been denying us our right to our land, our right to, you know, define our own human experience, we are going to forgive you. And what is important, what our traditions, what Tutu would say Christian theology, but of course he's tapping into Ubuntu and he explicitly states that, we have to forge a loving, caring, and nurturing South African community because we have been brought up in African traditions that say never, never use a human being as a means to an end, and give every human being an opportunity to be a human being. For instance, in South Africa, in Zulu, in Zambia, in a language called Tonga, when you see somebody, the first thing you say to them is in Zulu is in Tonga is mwabonwa. Mwabonwa means you have been seen. So that's the first thing that you are expected to say to somebody the first time you meet them in the morning or any time of the day. The first time you meet them, you have to say mwabonwa, that you've been seen, that is, you've been seen as an equal human being like me. And then from there, you can say, how are you? So each time you have to enact and recognize the foundation, the basis of how you're going to relate for the rest of the day. That is your equal humanity or humanness that you share. And it depends on you respecting and recognizing that for you actually to end the day as human beings. So that feeds also to a certain extent in, the framing of the truth and reconciliation in South Africa, but also, for instance, in the first president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, who talks about African humanism or Zambian humanism, you see this again coming, saying God has done this and that, but then you see this, Bantu or Ubuntu philosophy, giving a certain emphasis on, human relations, on community, on, co-responsibility. And a lot of other theologians now are taking this up. And in a lot of sort of churches that have the freedom to write their own theology, unlike the Catholic Church, you see a lot of incorporation of, Ubuntu cosmology, theology into, the Christian theologies.
It's basically what you're basically saying in a way is that it's the acknowledgement of everyone, right? It's an acknowledgement. It's basically knowing that they are there, they are a person, and we are connecting on some sort of level. So how would you say that, I guess, with Bantu philosophy would be able to provide, I guess, the tools for healing from this type of legacy?
Definitely. I firmly believe that Ubuntu philosophy has a lot to offer to our broken and, death-making world, really. Because, of course, when sometimes you read some philosophical texts, people tend to get all caught up in these intellectual discussions and, looking for how flawed one's argument is and all that, which can be interesting, but that's it. But really, when it comes to finding ways through which to heal and rebuild, this world that, has been broken by racial colonialism through Western Christianity and religion, Bantu Ubuntu philosophy has a very, very important role to make. And it's a pity. I think a few years ago, there's this philosopher, Achille Mbembe and Ben Stigler, they were engaged in a debate. Achille Mbembe is a prominent African philosopher from Cameroon, but he lives in South Africa. And Ben Stigler died. He was involved in environmental ethics and all that. He pointed out to Stigler that, now you are talking about environmental justice, relationships to the environment should change. But these are the views that your forefathers called animism in Africa. They said this is not religion, this is animism. But now even scholars and some activists, in like white activists, like very white, who are thinking of saving the planet, not for entire human beings, but for white people. They are still tapping into the wisdom, if not tapping, but recognizing the wisdom of, cosmologies and philosophies such as Ubuntu philosophy, to say nature is not there to be used. As sometimes Christians would say, we've created everything, it's for you to decide what you want to do with them. Ubuntu philosophy is saying, no, it's not up to us. We have to live together and, protect each other and nurture each other. So this really is coming into debates now. And sometimes people would talk about it, but still not recognize that actually there are communities that have had such, cosmological and philosophical views for, centuries. They don't want to recognize that, but they say, no, these cosmologies and philosophical views are very important and are necessary to saving our world. And even in democracy, for instance, a lot of Bantu philosophers have been saying, deliberative democracy, multi-party democracy, at least as it has figured in Africa, does not serve the interest of the community. In African democratic institutions, there was consensual democracy, where you have to sit down and come up with a decision or the course of action that benefits everybody. So it's not the Democrats winning and then the Republicans losing. It's no competition, because it's life that is at stake, and everybody's life.
Mm-hmm.
So you have views really that are coming in not only at the theological level, but also political level and also environmental level. That really, I think, if we look to, Ubuntu philosophy, of course, with a lot of cosmologies that also, emerge from the Caribbean, that really share this relational approach to, human existence, perhaps the world can take, a different direction.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Healing is definitely a major part of that as well. So, just as we come to a close to this great discussion, what would you say, to the listeners or to the viewers that are watching? What would you say in terms of them to take, I guess, one idea or one question from this particular article that you've researched into their own communities or faith spaces? What should it be?
I think they should try to understand religion, Christianity, Western Christianity, as a father in the house. And I'm using a father in a traditional, sexist sense as a father, but also a father who is abusive. The fact that the father is abusive, he doesn't stop being a father. Neither does he stop being abusive, the fact that he's a father. So the best way really is to look at this father and say, Father, let's sit down and talk. I've been brought up and raised by you, but the violence with which, the nurturing of your paternal responsibility has been very violent. So let's address this violence, and recognize the wounds that, we are constantly struggling with, and try to heal. So really, this article is suggesting that let's confront, especially for, us colonized people, for us, African people and African people of African descent, really, let's face Christianity as this very violent patriarchal father. That's what I would, invite the listeners really to do.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, because it is just to take things and have a different angle, different look, and to be able to take whatever we can to be able to move us forward, to grow and to heal from whatever.
Indeed.
Exactly. So again, I really do thank you so much for coming onto the podcast and discussing your article. It has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.